By the spring of 1942, the world was witnessing a military miracle, or a nightmare, depending on which side of the ocean you stood on. In the smoking aftermath of Pearl Harbor, the Empire of Japan didn't just advance, they exploded across the map. In less than 6 months, they had achieved what military planners thought would take years. They had humiliated the British Empire at Singapore. They had driven General Douglas MacArthur out of the Philippines. They had seized the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Japanese Navy, had warned against this unchecked expansion. He compared the empire's rapid growth to an octopus spreading its tentacles until it was spread almost flat. But the politicians and army leaders didn't listen. They wanted to seize territory to create a buffer zone so vast that the Americans could never penetrate it. And it was working. The Pacific Ocean was becoming a Japanese lake. But with this lightning speed came a dangerous psychological condition. In Tokyo, they called it senshobio, victory disease. It was a fatal arrogance. The Japanese high command began to believe their own propaganda. They believed the Americans were soft, demoralized, and incapable of fighting a hard war. Even after the Imperial Navy lost 4 aircraft carriers at the Battle of Midway in June, the victory disease blinded them. They viewed Midway as a temporary setback, concealing the true losses even from their own army. Instead of consolidating their gains, the octopus stretched one tentacle further south. The Japanese strategic goal shifted. They wanted to cut the lifeline between the United States and Australia. If they could sever the supply routes across the South Pacific, Australia would be isolated, defenseless, and eventually forced to surrender. To do this, they moved into a steamy, fever-ridden chain of islands called the Solomons. In early July 1942, an Allied reconnaissance plane flying high over the canopy of a mountainous island called Guadalcanal spotted something that made blood run cold in Washington, D.C. Japanese engineers were hacking a scar into the jungle floor at a place called Lunga Point. They weren't building barracks. They were building an airfield. The implications were terrifyingly simple. If the Japanese completed that runway, their long-range bombers could patrol the shipping lanes of the South Pacific. They could bomb Allied convoys with impunity. Guadalcanal would become an unsinkable aircraft carrier parked right on Australia's doorstep. The clock started ticking. Intelligence estimated the runway would be operational by mid-August. In Washington, this discovery triggered a vicious internal war. The Army argued they weren't ready. The supply chains weren't established. The troops were green. They didn't even have accurate maps of the island. The Navy was planning an invasion using old colonial charts and postcards. But Admiral Ernest King, the Chief of Naval Operations, was a man who reportedly shaved with a blowtorch. He looked at the reports and slammed his fist on the table. The luxury of time had vanished. He issued a direct ultimatum. The Navy and Marines would attack, and they would do it now. The operation was codenamed Watchtower, but the men who were frantically loading ammunition and supplies onto the ships, hodgepodge and without order, gave it a different name. They called it Operation Shoestring. On July 31st, a massive armada slipped out of Fiji, sailing into the unknown. They were racing against the Japanese construction crews on Lunga Point. The Allied commanders hoped for surprise. They hoped the Japanese victory disease had made them careless. But as the fleet sailed toward the equator, Admiral King knew he was rolling the dice with the entire Pacific Fleet. If this failed, the octopus would wrap its tentacles around Australia, and the door to the Pacific would slam shut.
History remembers victories, but it often forgets the chaos that precedes them. As the Allied fleet gathered in South Pacific in late July 1942, the atmosphere wasn't one of professional precision. It was one of frantic, terrifying improvisation. The official name for the invasion of Guadalcanal was Operation Watchtower, a stoic, reassuring title. But down in the stifling holds of the transport ships, among the sweating, cursing men of the 1st Marine Division, it had earned a different name, Operation Shoestring. It was a nickname born from a grim reality. This invasion was being assembled with a haste that bordered on recklessness. The timetable had been slashed from months to weeks. On the docks of Wellington, New Zealand, the preparation looked less like a military operation and more like a chaotic fire sale. Because the dock workers were on strike, the Marines had to load their own ships. For days, in driving rain, they engaged in a logistical nightmare, unstowing cargo and reloading it for combat. Boxes of ammunition burst open on the wet concrete. Crates of cornflakes were stacked next to mortar shells. Essential equipment was left behind simply because there was no room or no time to find it. General Alexander Vandegrift, the commander of the 1st Marine Division, watched this unfolding disaster with a knot in his stomach. He had been promised 6 months to train his men and prepare for their first offensive. Admiral King had given him less than 4 weeks. Vandegrift knew that his division was being sent into the meat grinder with less than half the supplies a standard invasion force required. They were sailing with only 60 days of rations and 10 days of ammunition. If the Navy couldn't keep the supply lines open, the Marines would starve before they were even shot. The men themselves were a study in contrast. The 1st Marine Division was an elite unit on paper, but in reality, they were untested. They were tough, eager, and filled with the bravado of volunteers, but the vast majority had never heard a shot fired in anger. They were sailing to fight veterans of the Imperial Japanese Army who had been conquering Asia for years. To make matters worse, the American equipment was dangerously outdated. While the U.S. Army in Europe was beginning to receive the semi-automatic M1 Grand Rifle, the Marines hitting the beach at Guadalcanal were still carrying the M1903 Springfield. It was a bolt-action rifle, a relic of the First World War. It was accurate, deadly, and slow. Against the rapid-fire Nambu machine guns and knee mortars of the Japanese infantry, every second spent working a bolt action could be the difference between life and death. But the greatest enemy the Marines faced in those final days before the landing wasn't the Japanese. It was the great unknown. In modern warfare, intelligence is oxygen. You need to know where the enemy is, what the terrain looks like, and where the fresh water is. For Guadalcanal, the U.S. Navy had nothing. The island was a ghost on their charts. The intelligence officers were humiliated to admit that their strategic maps were actually just old colonial sea charts that marked the depth of the water but left the island itself as a blank white void. Desperate for anything, intelligence officers in New Zealand had scoured local bookstores and archives. They found photographs from missionaries and faded postcards from colonial administrators who had lived there decades ago. This is how they planned the first American offensive of World War II, squinting at travel postcards, trying to guess if a patch of gray in a grainy photo was a solid beach or a mangrove swamp that would swallow a tank whole. They knew the coastline, but beyond the tree line, Guadalcanal was terra incognita, a mystery wrapped in jungle. As the fleet of 75 ships moved north from Fiji, tension hung over the armada like a physical weight. They were entering the slot, the narrow channel of water running through the Solomon Islands. To the Japanese, this was home waters. Their long-range patrol planes from Rabaul scoured these seas daily. If the Allied fleet was spotted early, the Japanese bombers would descend like a swarm of hornets, and the transport ships, thin-skinned and slow, would become steel coffins for thousands of Marines. The commanders paced the bridges, scanning the horizon, waiting for the inevitable shout of a lookout spotting a Japanese snooper plane. Total secrecy was their only armor, but in the vast, clear Pacific, hiding an invasion fleet seemed impossible. Then, a miracle happened. As the armada approached the final leg of the journey, the weather turned. A thick, soupy front of mist and rain descended over the Solomon Sea. The ceiling dropped to the waves. Visibility was cut to almost zero. Under normal circumstances, navigating a massive fleet in such weather would be a nightmare. But for the men of Operation Watchtower, it was divine intervention. For 2 days and nights, the fleet steamed under a blanket of gray fog. High above them, Japanese patrol planes droned in the clear sky, blindly searching the ocean, completely unaware that under the clouds, the largest amphibious force the Allies had ever assembled was moving silently toward their throat. On the night of August 6th, the storm broke just as the fleet slipped around the western edge of Guadalcanal. The moon remained hidden. The silence was absolute. Below decks, the young Marines sharpened bayonets and wrote final letters that they hoped would never be mailed. They checked their bolt-action Springfields and tried to sleep in the stifling heat, sweating out the fear. They were 11,000 men sailing on a shoestring, with half the ammo they needed, maps they couldn't read, and rifles from the last war. As the dark outline of the island appeared against the stars, the joking stopped. The victory disease had made the Japanese complacent, but the Americans were about to find out that a cornered empire fights with a ferocity that no map or postcard could ever predict.
At 6:14 a.m. on August 7, 1942, the sun rising over the Solomon Sea was blotted out by smoke. The heavy cruisers Quincy and Vincennes unleashed a thunderous bombardment onto the shoreline of Guadalcanal, turning the coconut groves into splintered matchsticks. Inside the landing craft, bobbing in the chop, thousands of young Marines gripped their gunwales, knuckles white, waiting for the inevitable slaughter. They had been raised on stories of the Japanese war machine, the unstoppable force that had crushed armies across Asia. As the ramps dropped into the surf, every man braced for the chatter of machine guns and the roar of artillery. But there was nothing. The Marines stormed Red Beach, screaming battle cries that were swallowed by the jungle. There were no bunkers, no barbed wire, no enemy soldiers waiting in the tree line. The silence was absolute, broken only by the squawk of tropical birds and the crunch of boots on sand. It was spooky. It felt wrong. To a soldier, an empty battlefield is often more terrifying than an active one because the imagination fills the void with ambushes that aren't there. The 1st Marine Division pushed inland, waiting for the trap to spring. Instead, they walked into a ghost town. They found the Japanese construction camp at Lunga Point completely abandoned. It was a scene frozen in time, like the Mary Celeste of the jungle. On the mess tables, bowls of rice were still warm. Pots of food simmered over open fires. Tools lay dropped in the mud where laborers had fled just minutes before. In the officers' tents, the Marines found bottles of sake, ice chests, and crisp white uniforms hanging on pegs. The Japanese had been so utterly surprised by the arrival of the American fleet that they had simply evaporated into the dense green interior of the island. By the afternoon of August 8th, the Marines had achieved their primary objective without a serious fight. They stood on the edge of the unfinished airfield, a rough scar of coral and dirt hacked out of the kunai grass. They raised the American flag and christened it Henderson Field, named after a pilot killed at the Battle of Midway. It seemed like a miracle. They had walked right into the heart of the enemy's new fortress and taken it for free. But as the sun began to set over Guadalcanal, a creeping paranoia set in. The Japanese hadn't surrendered. They were watching from the tree line, waiting, gathering in the dark. The ease of the victory on the main island felt like the calm before a hurricane. 20 miles across the Sea Lark Channel, on the smaller islands of Tulagi and Gavutu, there was no silence. There was only hell. While the main force was enjoying a cakewalk on Guadalcanal, the Marine Raiders, the Corps' elite special operations units, were discovering the true face of the Pacific War. Their target was the Japanese naval headquarters for the region, dug into the high limestone cliffs of Tulagi. Leading the assault was Colonel Merritt Red Mike Edson, a man with ice-blue eyes and a reputation for fearlessness. Here, the geography fought against the Americans. Tulagi wasn't a flat jungle, it was a jagged rock rising out of the sea, honeycombed with natural limestone caves and coral ridges. The Japanese garrison here, unlike the construction crews on Guadalcanal, were combat troops from the elite 3rd Corps Special Naval Landing Force. They had no intention of running. As Edson's raiders hit the beach, the fire was immediate and withering. The Japanese had turned the caves into impregnable fortresses. They had positioned machine gun nests behind steel doors built into the rock face.
When the Marines advanced, the cliffs themselves seemed to spit fire. This was the moment the American military learned the darkest lesson of the war. The Japanese soldier would not surrender. On Tulagi and the tiny connected islets of Gavutu and Tanambogo, the fighting wasn't a battle of maneuver, it was a medieval siege fought with modern weapons. The Marines would throw grenades into a cave entrance, hear the explosion, and move on, only to be shot in the back by the same Japanese soldiers who had crawled out of a hidden spider hole connected to the cave by a tunnel. Nightfall brought a new kind of terror. The Japanese did not hunker down, they infiltrated. Under the cover of darkness, stripping off their uniforms and greasing their bodies to slip through barbed wire, Japanese soldiers crawled into the Marine foxholes with knives. They hid under the floorboards of the captured buildings, thrusting bayonets up through the wood into the sleeping Americans. It was savage, intimate violence. The fighting on the terrifyingly small causeway connecting Gavutu and Tanambogo became a slaughterhouse. Marine paratroopers tried to charge across the exposed strip of land and were cut to ribbons by crossfire from machine guns hidden in the coral caves. The bodies piled up so high they blocked the path of the living. To root the enemy out, the Marines had to improvise fast. Rifle fire was useless against stone. They began tying bundles of dynamite to long poles, sprinting up to the cave mouth and shoving the charges deep inside. A dull thump would shake the ground, followed by silence. But even then, it wasn't enough. The solution was fire. For the first time, the Marines brought flamethrowers to the front lines en masse. It was a gruesome necessity. They would pour streams of liquid fire into the dark openings of the limestone dugouts. The screams that echoed out of the burning caves chilled the blood of even the hardest veterans. It took 3 days of savage, close-quarters butchery to secure Tulagi and Gavutu. The casualty rates were staggering. On the tiny island of Tanambogo alone, the Japanese garrison fought to the last man. Out of hundreds of defenders, only a handful were taken prisoner, and most of those were too wounded to pull the pins on their own grenades. The contrast between the two landings was jarring. On Guadalcanal, 11,000 Marines sat nervously around a captured airfield, swatting mosquitoes and eating Japanese rice, waiting for a fight that hadn't happened. Across the bay, the raiders were stacking American bodies on the pier and washing the blood of 1,500 Japanese off the coral rocks. The deceptive silence of the main island had lulled the commanders into a false sense of security, while the hornet's nest of Tulagi had given them a terrifying glimpse of the future. But neither group knew that the real disaster wasn't happening in the caves or the jungle. It was brewing in the sky and on the sea, where the Empire of Japan was preparing a response that would turn the calm waters around them into a graveyard of ships.
While the Marines were discovering the grim reality of cave warfare on Tulagi, a different kind of storm was gathering 600 miles to the northwest. At the sprawling Japanese fortress of Rabaul, the alarm klaxons began to scream. The reaction was instantaneous. The pilots of the Tainan Air Group, the Imperial Navy's most elite fighter unit, sprinted to their machines. These were the Sky Samurai, men who had swept the skies clean over China, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies. They climbed into the cockpits of the Mitsubishi A6M0, an aircraft that had already achieved mythical status. Within minutes, the roar of engines shook the palm trees as flight after flight of Zeros and heavy bombers clawed for altitude. Their mission was simple: fly down the island chain, find the American invasion fleet, and bury it under a deluge of steel and fire. But this mission carried a heavy price tag. The round trip to Guadalcanal was over 1,000 miles, the absolute limit of fighter range. Any pilot who used too much fuel in combat or took even a single bullet in his fuel tank was a dead man walking. As the Japanese formation thundered south, two philosophies of war were about to collide at 20,000 feet. The Japanese Zero was a masterpiece of offensive engineering. It was built like a fine sword, light, incredibly fast, and possessing a turning radius that defied physics. To achieve this, the designers had stripped away everything heavy. There was no armor plating for the pilot, and the gas tanks were unsealed and flammable. The Zero was built to kill, not to survive. Waiting for them over Guadalcanal were the Americans in their Grumman F-4F Wildcats.
The Wildcat was the antithesis of the Zero. It was stubby, heavy, and slower. The Japanese pilots mocked it, calling it a Grumman Ironworks truck. But the Wildcat had secrets. It had heavy armor plating behind the pilot's seat. It had self-sealing fuel tanks that wouldn't explode when hit. It was built like a tank. Among the Japanese pilots leading the charge was Petty Officer First Class Saburo Sakai. Even among the elite, Sakai was a legend. With dozens of aerial victories to his name, he fought with a cold, predatory precision. To him, the American pilots were clumsy amateurs flying brick-like airplanes. As the Japanese formation arrived over Guadalcanal, the sky erupted into chaos. Sakai dove into the fray, his eyes scanning for prey. He immediately latched onto a Wildcat. He expected a quick kill. He poured 20mm cannon fire into the American plane, waiting for the inevitable explosion. It didn't happen. Chunks of metal flew off the Wildcat, but it kept flying. Sakai was stunned. He hammered it again and again. The American plane absorbed punishment that would have vaporized a Zero 3 times over. Finally, the Wildcat smoked and spiraled down, but the lesson was jarring. These new enemies were flying shields, and they refused to die easily. Flush with the adrenaline of the kill, Sakai climbed back up, looking for more targets. Through the clouds, he spotted a formation of 8 American planes below him. In the distance, they looked like Wildcats. It was the only mistake Saburo Sakai would make that day, and it almost cost him his life. The planes weren't Wildcats. They were TBF Avengers, new heavy torpedo bombers. Crucially, unlike the Wildcat, the Avenger had a rear-facing machine gun turret. Sakai, thinking he was bouncing helpless fighters, approached him from the rear, dead 6 o'clock, slowing down to line up a perfect kill shot. He had walked into a trap of his own making. As Sakai closed within range, he realized his error. He saw the dorsal turret spin toward him. Before he could react, 8 50-caliber machine guns opened up in unison. The impact was catastrophic. Bullets shredded the engine cowling. The glass canopy shattered into 1,000 razor-sharp shards. A bullet struck Sakai in the right side of his head. It blinded his right eye instantly and paralyzed the entire left side of his body. Blood filled his good eye, plunging his world into red darkness. His Zero snapped into an inverted dive, screaming toward the ocean. Sakai, drifting in and out of consciousness, felt the G-forces tearing at him. The rushing wind roared through the broken cockpit. By sheer instinct, his good hand hauled back on the stick, just feet above the Whitecaps. He leveled out, but his situation was hopeless. He was bleeding to death, half blind, half paralyzed, and he was 560 miles from home. For the next 4.5 hours, Saburo Sakai fought a private war against pain and gravity. He had to hold the stick with his one good hand. He couldn't turn his head. Every time he felt himself slipping into a coma from blood loss, he would slam his fist into his own wound, using the spike of agony to shock himself awake. He hallucinated. He saw American ships in the clouds and considered diving into them to die a warrior's death. But the clouds vanished, revealing only the empty, uncaring ocean. He flew on, navigating by memory and the position of the sun. When the volcano of Rabaul finally appeared on the horizon, it seemed like a mirage. Sakai had no radio. His fuel gauge was tapping on empty. As he approached the runway, he couldn't see the ground clearly through the blood and the cracked glass. He came in fast, ignoring the standard protocols, and slammed the Zero onto the dirt strip. The plane bounced, skidded, and came to a halt. When the ground crew rushed to the aircraft, they recoiled in horror. The cockpit was awash in blood. Sakai, a mask of red gore, slowly unbuckled his harness. He refused to be carried on a stretcher until he had made his post-flight report to his superior officer. Only after he had saluted did he collapse. Sakai had survived the impossible, but the skies over the Solomons had changed. The days of easy victories were over. The Japanese sky samurai had met an enemy that relied not on elegance, but on brutal durability and massed firepower. And while Sakai was being rushed to surgery, out in the deep water, the American carriers that had launched those planes were turning their rudders. They were sailing away, leaving the Marines on the beach alone to face the coming night.
While the doctors in Rabaul were fighting to save Saburo Sakai's life, a different kind of struggle was taking place in the wardroom of the USS Saratoga. It was a conflict not of bullets, but of will and fear. The outcome would determine the fate of every Marine standing on the beaches of Guadalcanal. The man at the center of the storm was Vice Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher. He commanded Task Force 61, the mighty aircraft carrier group that was the only shield protecting the invasion fleet. Fletcher was a man haunted by the ghosts of the recent past. He had seen the carrier Lexington burn and sink at the Battle of the Coral Sea. He knew that the United States had only a handful of these precious capital ships left. In his mind, the carriers were the queens of the chessboard. Losing them meant losing the war. As the sun dipped below the horizon on the evening of August 8th, Fletcher made a calculation that historians would debate and Marines would curse for decades. He looked at his fuel reports. He looked at the reports of the Japanese air attacks that day. He decided that the risk to his carriers was too high. Despite previous agreements to cover the landing force for at least 3 days, Fletcher announced his intention to withdraw. He sent a message to Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, the commander of the amphibious fleet responsible for the transport ships. The message was terse and shocking. Fighter plane strength reduced from 99 to 78. Fuel for carrier task forces running low. Recommend immediate withdrawal. Admiral Turner was thunderstruck. He was in the middle of unloading thousands of tons of critical supplies, food, ammunition, heavy artillery, and medical gear. The unloading was behind schedule. The beaches were chaotic. If the carriers left, the air umbrella protecting his slow, fat transport ships would vanish. They would be sitting ducks for Japanese bombers. Turner argued desperately. He pointed out that the fuel situation wasn't critical. The carriers could easily loiter for another day. He argued that the loss of 21 fighters was negligible compared to the strategic disaster of abandoning the beachhead. But Fletcher was immovable. His decision was final. At 6:07 p.m., without waiting for a reply or a counter-order, Admiral Fletcher ordered his task force to change course. The sailors on the decks of the transports watched in disbelief as the silhouettes of the Saratoga, the Enterprise, and the Wasp turned their sterns to Guadalcanal. They picked up speed and steamed south, disappearing into the gathering gloom. The psychological impact was devastating. The Great Betrayal, as it would come to be known in Marine Corps lore, had begun. For Admiral Turner, the choice was now agonizing. He could not leave the transports exposed in enemy waters without air cover. He made the only decision he could. The supply ships would have to pull out the next morning. This meant that the 11,000 Marines on shore would be left with whatever they had managed to drag onto the sand in the last 36 hours. They would have no heavy radar, no construction equipment to finish the airfield, and critically, no air support. As night settled over the Iron Bottom Sound, a heavy, suffocating dread descended on the fleet. The destroyers and cruisers patrolling the entrance to the bay were now the only line of defense. They were tired. The crews had been at general quarters for 2 days straight. They were running on caffeine and adrenaline, squinting into the blackness of the slot. They didn't know it yet, but the departure of the carriers had unlocked the door for the enemy. Up in the slot, Admiral Mikawa's fleet was tearing through the water at 26 knots, hidden by the darkness, rushing toward the unprotected Americans, like wolves descending on a fold that had just lost its shepherd. The umbrella was gone, and the storm was about to break.
The sun vanished, and the moon was hidden behind thick, wet monsoon clouds. A heavy, suffocating blackness settled over the body of water between Guadalcanal, Saville Island, and Florida Island. To the Allied sailors keeping watch, the darkness was absolute. They could barely see the bow of their own ships. They assumed that if they couldn't see, the enemy couldn't see either. They were wrong. While the exhausted American and Australian crews dozed at their battle stations, fighting to keep their eyes open after 48 hours of continuous alert, a phantom was rushing toward them at 26 knots. It was Admiral Gunichi Mikawa's assault force.
7 cruisers, and 1 destroyer. Mikawa's fleet wasn't just moving under the cover of darkness, it was weaponized by it. For decades, the Imperial Japanese Navy had trained obsessively for exactly this scenario. While the U.S. Navy relied on technology and fought largely during the day, the Japanese had mastered the night. Their lookouts were hand-picked for exceptional night vision and trained with special oversized binoculars to spot silhouettes against a black horizon long before radar could pick them up. But Mikawa had something even deadlier than good eyes. Loaded in the tubes of his cruisers was the Type 93 torpedo. The Allies called it the Long Lance. It was a secret weapon of terrifying efficiency. Unlike Western torpedoes, which ran on compressed air and left a visible trail of bubbles, the Long Lance was oxygen-fueled. It was smokeless, wakeless, and invisible. It carried a massive 1,080-pound warhead, twice the explosive power of American torpedoes, and it could travel 22 miles at high speed. The Allied ships sitting in the Sound were well within range before they even knew a battle had started. At 1 a.m., Mikawa's column slipped past the picket destroyer USS Blue. The American ship's radar was primitive, blinded by the interference of the land masses. The lookouts, zombie-like from fatigue, stared into the void and saw nothing. The Japanese ships passed so close that Mikawa could see the white uniforms of the American sailors on the deck of the Blue, yet the alarm was never raised. The wolves were inside the fence. At 1:31 a.m., the nightmare began not with a roar, but with a light. High above the sleeping fleet, Japanese float planes dropped parachute flares. They popped with a hiss, bathing the Allied ships in a ghostly, brilliant yellow-green light. The American and Australian ships were suddenly illuminated like stage actors in the spotlight, while Mikawa's force remained invisible in the darkness behind the glare. Then, the water erupted. The first victim was the HMS Canberra. Before her captain could shout orders, 2 long lances slammed into her hull. Simultaneously, Japanese shells smashed into her bridge and boiler rooms. The cruiser lost power, lost steering, and began to list, all within 2 minutes. She was a dead ship before her gunners fired a shot. The USS Chicago, close behind, had her bow blown off by a torpedo. Having crippled the Southern force in minutes, Mikawa turned his guns north, towards the 3 American heavy cruisers patrolling the upper entrance to the Sound, the Vincennes, the Quincy, and the Astoria. What happened next was not a battle. It was an execution. On the bridge of the USS Astoria, the captain awoke to the sound of explosions, thinking his own ships were firing at each other in confusion. He actually ordered a ceasefire. Seconds later, the Japanese searchlight snapped on. The beams were blindingly bright, cutting through the night to pin the American ships against the dark sky. The Japanese gunnery was surgical. They didn't just fire at the hulls, they aimed for the bridges, intending to decapitate the command structures immediately. The Astoria was raked from bow to stern. Her superstructure became a funnel of fire. The USS Quincy tried to charge the Japanese searchlights. Her forward guns roared, but she was caught in a crossfire between 2 Japanese columns. A shell hit her float plane hangar, igniting the aviation fuel. The Quincy didn't just burn, it glowed. The fire was so intense that Marines on the beaches of Guadalcanal, 20 miles away, watched in horror as the jungle around them was illuminated by the flickering orange light of their dying navy. The Quincy's captain was killed when a shell hit the bridge, and as the ship rolled over and sank, her forward turret fired one last defiant shot while going underwater. The USS Vincennes, the flagship of the Northern Group, took the worst beating of all. She was hit by at least 2 torpedoes and over 70 large-caliber shells. Her hoist systems failed, her steering jammed, and she spiraled into the water, taking hundreds of men down to the bottom of the Sound. It was all over in 40 minutes. Admiral Mikawa, looking at the burning wreckage of the Allied fleet, checked his watch. It was barely 2:20 a.m. He had achieved one of the most lopsided naval victories in history. He had sunk 4 heavy cruisers and damaged a 5th, virtually wiping out the Allied heavy surface force in the Solomons. But then, amidst the smoke and adrenaline, Mikawa made a mistake. He looked at his charts and calculated the distance to the American carriers. He didn't know that Admiral Fletcher had already fled. He assumed that U.S. carriers would be launching airstrikes at dawn. Fearing for his own ships, Mikawa ordered a withdrawal. He turned his back on the helpless, unarmed transport ships that were still sitting off the beach full of the food and ammunition the Marines desperately needed. He had won the battle, but by failing to sink the transports, he had failed to win the war. As the Japanese engines faded into the north, a stunned silence returned to the sound, broken only by the hissing of steam from sinking ships and the cries of men swimming in oil-slicked water. The morning sun rose on a scene of utter devastation. The water was thick with debris, oil, and bodies. 1,077 Allied sailors were dead. Another 700 were wounded. It was the worst open-sea defeat the United States Navy had ever suffered, and it would remain so. The waters north of Guadalcanal, filled with the wreckage of so many gallant ships, earned a new name that morning. The maps called it Sea Lark Channel. The sailors and Marines would forever call it Iron Bottom Sound.
As dawn broke on August 9th, the waters of Iron Bottom Sound were still churning with oil and debris, but the Japanese fleet was gone. Admiral Mikawa, having delivered the most crushing naval blow in American history, had made a decision that would ultimately doom the Japanese Empire. Standing on the bridge of the Chokai, staring at the undefended American transport ships in the distance, he had hesitated. Mikawa didn't know that the U.S. aircraft carriers had already fled the previous night. He assumed they were just over the horizon, ready to launch dawn airstrikes. Haunted by the fear of losing his own ships to American dive bombers, Mikawa ordered his victorious fleet to turn north and race back to Rabaul. He left the transport ships, the soft underbelly of the invasion, completely untouched. It was a tactical masterpiece, followed by a strategic blunder. But for the Marines on Guadalcanal, Mikawa's mercy was short-lived. Admiral Turner, commanding the amphibious fleet, looked at the devastation of his escort force. He looked at the empty sky where Fletcher's air cover should have been. He realized that if he stayed one more night, his transports would be at the bottom of the sea alongside the cruisers. He made the only choice a naval commander could make, but it was a choice that felt like a knife in the back to the men ashore. He ordered the withdrawal. On the beaches of Lunga Point, the unloading stopped. The cranes froze. The engines of the transport ships rumbled to life, churning up the sand. 11,000 Marines stopped digging foxholes and walked down to the water's edge. They stood in stunned silence, shielding their eyes against the sun, watching the impossible happen. The ships were leaving. They weren't just taking the sailors, they were taking the heavy artillery, the barbed wire, the construction equipment, and most of the food. As the last transport hull dipped below the horizon, a profound loneliness washed over the 1st Marine Division. General Vandegrift took stock of his situation, and the math was terrifying. The Navy had dumped 11,000 men on a hostile island and left them with only 4 days' worth of ammunition. They had rations for 30 days, provided they only ate twice a day. They had no air support, no radar, and no way off the island. They were effectively shipwrecked. To survive, the elite U.S. Marines were forced to become scavengers. They broke into the captured Japanese food stores, surviving on liberated fish heads and worm-infested rice. They used captured Japanese trucks and Japanese shovels to frantically finish the Japanese airfield. As the sun set on August 9th, the Marines were no longer an invasion force. They were the hunted. They dug into the perimeter of the airfield, listening to the jungle come alive with the sounds of insects and tropical birds. But deeper in the tree line, other sounds were beginning to emerge, the clanking of equipment and the movement of thousands of men. The Japanese army, humiliated by the loss of the airfield, was gathering its strength. They were experts in jungle warfare, night attacks, and psychological terror. The U.S. Navy was gone. The cakewalk was over. The Marines were alone, backs to the sea, facing an enemy that regarded surrender as a sin. The Battle of the Beach was finished. The battle for Guadalcanal, the starving, bleeding, rotting nightmare in the jungle, had just begun.